Welcome back, brothers, to Warhammer. Tonight we're doing in-depth on the brand new lore that's just dropped, involving Tyberos being wounded. Before we get to that, be sure to like and comment any videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor. I want to thank you guys for the support. I've been killing it like always. Now, let's get into the video.
The first time the Red Wake truly bleeds, it happens in the shadows of an unremarkable forge world, far from the demarcation lines that administratum clerks like to draw across star charts. It does not occur in the blazing center of some crusade, with banners raised and trumpets sounding. It happens under a stained sky of chem clouds and furnace light, during a grey tithe that is meant to be routine, a transaction of flesh and metal between predators who serve the same dying empire. It happens in the account named A Tithe of Shadows, bound alongside the chronicle called Void Exile, and it changes the way the Void itself seems to whisper the title Tyberos. For long years measured in dead systems and stripped hive levels, the Shade Lord has been one of those fixed shapes in the nightmare of the 41st millennium, Lord of the Red Brethren, Master of the Nicor, a giant whose presence is recorded more in casualty ledgers than in dialogue. When the Carcharodons Astra fall upon a world, the archive does not speak of inspiring speeches and carefully worded litanies. It speaks of void silent approach, of reactor levels disappearing into the night, of vox traffic cutting out mid-scream as grey armoured killers move through bulkheads and warrens. Behind all of that walks Tyberos, a mass of tactical dreadnought plate and ritual scars, his name a curse shared between survivors who never quite saw him clearly. The new account does something sharp and deliberate to that legend. It takes that silent, looming constant and breaks his armor in half. During a grey tithe on a remote forge world, the Carcharodons come to feed the ledger. A tithe is not a parade, nor a pilgrimage. It is a balance sheet rendered in promethium and blood. The nomad predation fleet requires munitions, replacement plate, genetic stock, and forbidden mechanisms dredged up from vaults that should never have been opened. In return, the sharks of the outer dark erase problems that the Adeptus Mechanicus cannot or will not acknowledge in the light of day. Hairtech enclaves, warp-tainted scrap worlds, rogue data cults that have grown too bold. The chapter does not debate the moral texture of such work. It simply fulfills its part of the exchange. Tyberos attends this particular tithe in person. That alone carries weight. The Shade Lord is not a lord militant who travels with a retinue of gilded advisors. When he leaves the decks of the Nicor, it is because his presence is required to balance the scales of dread and obligation. He walks the metal avenues of the Forge world in ancient Terminator plate, vast even by the standards of his breed of demigod. His hands end in the paired monstrosities called Hunger and Slake, lightning claws of unknown pattern whose maws bite through ceramite and bone with the same quiet hunger. The tapping of his boots on deck plating is its own kind of litany. The welcoming honor guard are Sicarian rust stalkers, Skitari assassins built for surgical murder in the name of the Omnisire. They advance with blades held in ritual acknowledgement, optics glowing in the fumes, forms shrouded in draped cables and incense. They are meant to be a symbol of trust between bloodless priests of the machine and the grey sharks of the void. Then, without warning, the symbol turns. The rust stalkers pivot in unison, like a single thought made manifold. Blades made to unpick tanks and bisect armored targets scissor inward. They fall upon the chapter master of the Carcharodons in a storm of accelerated limbs and whispered code prayers, servos shrieking, toxic blades seeking joints and weak points. They have not come to honor the tithe. They have come to kill the shark. The impact is catastrophic. Terminator plate that has endured the Badab War and countless nameless exterminations buckles and cracks under that engineered assault. Ceramite fractures, adamantium rods snap, pistons tear free from their housings, rust stalker blades punch, through layered armor and bite into the flesh beneath, channeling nerve-searing poisons and industrial-strength trauma into a body already swollen beyond the designs of the gene forge. There is no clean duel, no stately exchange of measured blows. It is an ambush, a mass assassination attempt against a single colossal target, executed with all the cold precision of the Mechanicus. Tyberos does not die. That is important. The story is clear on that point. The Rust Stalkers are destroyed. The hidden heretic mastermind behind them is unmasked. A dark Mechanicus tech priest using the grey Tithe as a blade to drive into the heart of a chapter he has no right to touch. The Carcharodons respond with the savage, methodical violence that has turned so many worlds into grey silence. The treachery is punished. The tithe is paid, in blood if not in the coin intended. But when the claws stop moving and the furnace air clears, the Shade Lord is no longer the untouchable silhouette of old. He stands, if he stands at all, in ruin. His ancient Terminator armor is torn almost beyond recognition, torn open in places where it should have been as unyielding as a void ship's bulkhead. Systems that have sustained his wars for an age are gone, burned out, ripped away, or left hanging in tangled bundles. Flesh that should never have been exposed to the open air is torn and poisoned. Brothers who see him in those moments will carry that memory into whatever comes next. The first time they saw the Red Wake genuinely close to death. The text does not linger on the precise cartography of his wounds. This is not an autopsy report. It is a surgical cut into a myth. What it does make clear is that Tyberos is gravely, perhaps permanently wounded. The fate of his warplate is uncertain. The claw's hunger and slake are not lovingly catalogued after the fact. The account ends where any chapter apothecary's nightmare would begin, in that liminal space between battlefield survival and whatever form of continuation the chapter dares to attempt. For more than a decade, by most mortal calendars, Tyberos has existed in the lore as a kind of living punctuation mark. When he enters the story, things end. Reinforcements are cut to pieces. Secessionist forces in the Badab War die on the decks of their own ships, carved apart by a grey giant whose name is barely spoken. Forge World designs a hulking resin effigy of him, a slab of tactical Dreadnought armor with shark teeth trophies and a narrowed helm, and that image becomes fixed in the communal imagination. Later novels lean into that silhouette. He appears as a presence, a direction of travel, an overwhelming threat, but not as a mutable protagonist. He is myth made meat, on the rare occasions he is seen at all. Maiming a figure like that is not a casual choice. This is not the usual rhythm of the setting, where new armor marks slide onto old characters like aftermarket parts, and long dead names are pulled back out of the grave for another round of crusade. The galaxy of the 41st millennium is famously static. The Imperium does not progress. It decays, ossifies, staggers forward under the weight of its own rituals. Heroes and monsters alike are frozen in eternal war. Their stories are told and retold, their images cast and recast in plastic and metal, but the core of who they are rarely shifts in a fundamental way. When change does occur, it means something. A Primarch returns, and entire sectors burn. A chapter master falls, and a world of successors, rivals and enemies shakes. When the lord of a nomad predation fleet is brutalized and left clinging to life, when his armor is broken and his future deliberately obscured. That is not just color text, that is a signal flare in the void. In the grim darkness of the far future, there are fates for broken demigods that are worse than death and more complicated than natural recovery. A mortally wounded Astartes does not simply retire. If his chapter has the means, and if his record of slaughter is judged worthy, he is offered continuation in forms that would horrify any sane mortal. He may be forced across the churning Rubicon of Primaris augmentation, his gene-wrought frame stretched and reforged in agonizing transhuman surgery. Or he may be interred in iron, sealed into a sarcophagus slave to a walking war engine, condemned to wake in intervals of hate and pain as a dreadnought. The setting is full of these walking tombs, ancient heroes like Bjorn the Fell-Handed, entombed relics of the Great Crusade, entangled forever with their own rusting machine spirits. More recent examples, like Kuln reborn as a towering Leviathan. They are honored, of course, in the way that the Imperium honors anything. Their hulls are carved with sigils, priests croon over their machine spirits, battle brothers chant their names, but the reality inside the sarcophagus is a cage of amniotic fluid and hard-wired pain, a prison of memories and reflexes wired directly into artillery limbs. Salvation in this age often looks like being nailed into a metal coffin and wheeled out whenever the chapter needs something obliterated. That is the shadow hanging over Tyberos now. Not a heroic promotion, not some triumphal unveiling of a new suit of plate, but the question of what form of hell the Carcharodons will choose for their wounded lord. 40,000 is a jigsaw of accounts, not a clean historical line. The Badab War books, the Carcharodons trilogy by MacNiven, scattered entries in codex volumes and campaign supplements, the brief mentions of nomad predation fleets in other chapters' records, all of these are chipped tiles in a bloody mosaic. The new wound described in A Tithe of Shadows is one more fragment hammered into that surface. It does not overwrite what has come before. It sits alongside it, glinting with fresh blood, changing the color of the surrounding pieces. When you place that shard beside the others, certain shapes start to suggest themselves. One path is that the Red Wake survives in meat and ceramite, rebuilt in some new pattern of armor, perhaps taller, perhaps bearing the marks of Primaris biology. Another path is that he is entombed, his broken frame sealed into a custom sarcophagus and bolted into a Leviathan or something worse, emerging thereafter as a literal iron shark, a dreadnought that carries hunger and slake as oversized siege claws. A third path, the most conservative, is that he simply continues as a badly wounded Shade Lord in repaired plate, his survival marked only by a few new scars in the sparse accounts that mention him. Only the first two paths feel proportionate to what has been done to him. You do not strip a chapter master of his armor, announce that he has been cut almost to pieces by traitor constructs on a grey Tithe world, and leave the details hanging merely to say, many years later, that he got better and nothing much changed. In a narrative that crawls as slowly as this settings does, such a wound is not just a random injury, it is groundwork for transformation. Whether that transformation takes the form of Primaris escalation or Dreadnought damnation, it will drag the entire legend of the Carcharodons with it. If Tyberos becomes something new, the chapter becomes something new with him. That is the real stake behind the question. The Carcharodons are defined by predation, exile, and an almost impersonal brutality. They are the sharks in the outer dark, fleet-based hunters who arrive without warning, harvest their due in blood and gene stock, and vanish. In the era of the Great Rift and the Indomitus Crusade, when the Imperium is forced to look outward and inward at the same time, the way it chooses to preserve or consume assets like the Carcharodons says a great deal about its own desperation. Does it drag them closer to its new Primarch and his vision, forcing even the exiled sharks to bear the mark of Primaris renewal? Or does it drive them deeper into monstrosity, turning their master into a walking relic of iron and hate, something that is only ever woken when whole populations need to vanish? The blood in the water around Tyberos is thick with more than poisoned ichor. It carries the scent of decision. This first chapter sits at the edge of that abyss and names the question clearly. Who is the Red Wake, truly, beyond the armor that has been broken? What does it mean in this age to be entombed as a dreadnought rather than rebuilt as a Primaris lord? What exactly happens on that Forge world during the Grey Tithe, beneath the smoke and the treachery of the Dark Mechanicus? And when you follow those events to their logical end, does the trail lead more naturally to a new, towering suit of warplate, or to the locked sarcophagus of a living war tomb? The work ahead is to pick through those questions, like an apothecary through shards of shattered ceramite and wet meat, to lay out the lore of Tyberos, the nature of Dreadnoughts, the culture of the Carcharodons, and the precise wording of a tithe of shadows, and to decide whether the sharks of the outer dark are about to loose a new kind of monster into the void. To understand what it means for the Red Wake to bleed, you have to understand what he has been to the void for so long. Tyberos is not merely a chapter master in the bureaucratic sense that administratum clerks use when they scratch names into their ledgers. He is Reaper Lord of the Void, Lord of the Red Brethren, Master of the Nikor, a single will that has directed extermination fleets through the dark between the stars. When the Carcharodons Astra are invoked in the hushed arguments of segmentum commanders and inquisitors, when someone suggests sending for the sharks, what they are really invoking is him. His is the hand on the command throne, the gaze from the strategium, the silent judgment that weighs a world and decides whether it is tithed, culled, or erased. The Nikor is not a ship so much as a moving reef, a drifting shrine to predation. Its flanks are studded with weapons and launch bays. Its interior is a labyrinth of armories and oubliettes, holding pens and shrines to the silent god of the deep. In its hangars, the Red Brethren wait in their tactical dreadnought armor, each warrior a slab of ceramite and cerulean grey intent on the kill. Above even them looms Tyberos. Accounts from the Badab War and later texts are consistent on this point. He is a giant even among the Adeptus Astartes, towering over brothers already far beyond human. Even his own Terminators are described as smaller silhouettes beside him, lesser predators moving in the wake of something older and more terrible. His warplate has never been a neat standard pattern in the way that codices like to present such things. It is always written as overbuilt, layered with additional plating, trophies, crude oceanic motifs cut into the ceramite like ritual scars. The armor seems barely able to contain him, as if the flesh inside has outgrown the design originally intended for it. When he walks, there is a sense of mass that presses on the page. Even without hyperbolic embellishment, the picture is clear. Tyberos is a walking executioner, an apex predator shaped into ceramite and flesh, the embodiment of everything the chapter expects itself to be. The Badab War is where most readers first encountered him, not as a protagonist with an inner life, but as a force unleashed into an already complex civil conflict. The Maelstrom Zone burned as secessionist chapters tried to carve out their own destiny, and a desperate Imperium reached into the outer dark for a solution that did not require subtlety. The Carcharodons arrived unheralded, their nomad predation fleet sliding into the war like silent knives. There was no grand announcement, no long speeches of allegiance. Grey armored brothers simply began to appear on decks and in trenches where secessionists had previously felt safe. At the head of those incursions walked Tyberos. The campaign books describe him leading savage boarding actions, teleportarium strikes that turned proud strike cruisers into charnel houses in a matter of minutes. He and the Red Brethren cut their way through secessionist lines with an efficiency that bordered on the obscene, a butchery so one-sided that allies sometimes flinched from it. When planetary assaults were required, he did not stand at the rear directing orbital bombardments. He dropped with his first company, those hulking Terminators acting as his pack, punching directly into enemy command centers and fortifications. Witnesses do not recall inspirational speeches. They recall a grey giant with twin lightning claws, whose arrival meant that whatever fight they thought they were in had already been decided. Those claws, hunger and slake, are as much a part of his legend as the Nikor herself. Old Mechanicus records admit, grudgingly, that their exact pattern and manufacture are unknown. They are not neat relics fitted to a page in a reliquary ledger. They are things from the deep, gauntlets whose extended talons and internal mechanisms reduce armor and bone to fragments in an instant. In descriptions from the Badab War, they are less weapons than verdicts. Secessionist Astartes do not die with their names solemnly recorded. They vanish into the work of those claws, reduced to a spray of wreckage and a line in a casualty report. For all this, Tyberos does not shout his presence across the pages. He is remarkably quiet in the way he is written. In both campaign books and later Black Library narratives, he rarely speaks. When he does, his words are spare, and his decisions final. There is no wavering, no apparent doubt. Orders come in clipped phrases, decisive, unadorned by sermons. This silence is not emptiness, it is weight. The implication is always that much more is happening beneath the surface, that whatever logic guides the Reaper Lord is deep and cold, but the text does not invite you in to share it. You see the results, you do not share his internal monologue. That distance is deliberate. Forge World's work on the Badab War and the later novels that mention him treat Tyberos less as a man and more as an icon. You glimpse him through the eyes of others, loyalists seeing grey-armoured giants move through void-lit corridors, secessionists dying under his claws, mortal serfs and servitors feeling the weight of his presence as he passes, like some industrial deity of steel and scar tissue. You rarely, if ever, stand behind his eyes. He is not a chatty point-of-view narrator. He is the silhouette at the end of the corridor, the thing that happens to the enemy once the sharks have finished circling. This is where the nature of the Carcharodons themselves folds back into their master. They are a nomad predation chapter, a term that means more than simply fleet-based. They do not hold neat territories tied to specific segmentum maps. They prowl the outer dark, beyond stable imperial borders, appearing where they are sent or where some inscrutable internal calculus directs them. They are not crusaders with banners and long lists of oaths carved into their armor. They are reef sharks, following blood in the water. They arrive in silence, butcher those they have been pointed at, gather tithes of gene stock, slaves, relics and material, and then they leave. Worlds they save may be stripped of a significant portion of their population as recruitment stock. Worlds they condemn are filed under extermination and never spoken of again. Tyberos sits at the apex of that culture. He is not simply a commander in the sense that some line captain of a codex chapter might be. He is the mask the chapter wears when it chooses to show itself to the wider Imperium. When emissaries deal with inquisitors or magi of the Mechanicus, they invoke his titles and carry the weight of his reputation before them like a weapon. There are hints, scattered in accounts and fan speculation alike, that Tyberos as a name might be more office than individual, that there have been previous holders of the mantle, earlier Reaper Lords who wore different flesh, but the same title, the same armor, the same claws. In that reading, the man inside the warplate is less important than the role he fills. The shark is an idea, and individual teeth are replaceable. Whether or not you accept that interpretation, the way the lore has handled him supports it. Forge World sculpted a miniature that captures a specific look. Massive, hooded, shark teeth trophies, lightning claws spread wide. Black Library and related texts then use that image rather than expanding far beyond it. Tyberos appears as needed, does terrible things, and then recedes back into the dark. The Nikor moves on. The chapter continues its work in the outer dark. No one sits down to describe his childhood on some fortress monastery, his doubts, his private regrets. He is function, expressed through violence and ritual. Because of that, he has felt weirdly untouchable. In a setting that kills characters as a matter of daily routine, where entire chapters can vanish into warp storms between editions, there has been a sense that if anything was truly fixed about the Carcharodons, it was that somewhere out there in the void sailed the Nicor, and aboard her stalked Tyberos, the Red Wake. You could read about the chapter's gene seed quirks, about their tithe practices, about their occasional interactions with other Imperial forces, and through it all, that constant lay in the background. The sharks are still hunting. Their master is still with them. Do not worry about his exact location. The important thing is that he exists. The new wound takes that comforting horror and deliberately pulls it apart. To say that the assault by rust stalkers on the Forge world is an assassination attempt is true, but it is also inadequate. It is an assault on the idea of Tyberos as a fixed point. It is an act of narrative violence against the notion that he is immune not only to the weapons of his enemies, but to the very possibility of change. Rust stalkers are not blunt instruments. They are surgical tools shaped into murder machines, used when the Mechanicus wishes to unmake something precise. Turning them upon the Reaper Lord during a grey tithe, in a place where alliance and obligation should have been at their strongest, is like driving a scalpel into the heart of a god. When those blades tear through his warplate and into the flesh beneath, when ancient systems fracture and fail, and the Nicor's lord is left struggling not to fall, the law is tearing open more than ceramite. It is opening up the possibility space around him. The shark bleeds, the waters change color. From that moment on, every mention of Tyberos carries an unspoken question that was not there before. Is he still the same figure who strode through the Badab War, armor intact, claws hungry? Has the man inside been altered, augmented, elevated, or entombed? Has the office of Tyberos passed on to another butcher, the armor rebuilt around a different body? Or has the chapter done something more drastic, something that aligns with its own culture, of using whatever tools it must to continue the hunt? This is why his maiming matters so much more than the death of yet another named commander in some battle report. Tyberos has never been just a person in the Carcharodons' myth. He has been their reflection, their self-image cast onto the wider stage of the Imperium. To break him is to admit that even the sharks of the outer dark can be wounded, that their own way of war is vulnerable to betrayal and attrition. Whatever fate awaits the Red Wake will not be a private tragedy confined to an apothecarian. It will be a statement, written in gene-forged flesh and steel, about what the Carcharodons' Astra are becoming in this age of rifts and crusades. The monster you call Shadelord is no longer a fixed point. His silhouette is cracked. His blood is in the water. The chapter that once seemed content to send him stalking through the void unchanged must now decide what shape their fearsome mask will take next. The Carcharodons do not belong to any single star or shrine. They do not have a homeworld whose name appears in neat ink on administratum charts. They belong to the black between. They are a fleet, a moving wound in the void, and they have been that way for longer than most Imperial archives care to remember. Their remit, such as it is simple and obscene. They are unleashed into the outer dark, beyond the thin and failing borders of the Imperium proper, and told to make problems disappear. Out there, where the light of the Astronomicon is a memory and a rumor, things grow that should not grow. Empires of carrion gods, data cults breeding in the wreckage of forgotten crusades. Civilizations that survived the first compliance fleets and learned all the wrong lessons. The Carcharodons hunt such things. They exterminate, they cull, and they harvest. Harvest is not a metaphor. When the grey armoured predators of the nomad predation fleet fall upon a world, they do so with a ledger in one gene-wrought hand and a chain blade in the other. Populations are not simply liberated or left to rebuild. They are assessed, measured. Those deemed worthy are taken as tithes. Some will be pressed into servitor shells, their neural patterns stripped down and wired into the machinery that keeps the fleet moving. Others will be taken as neophytes, their bodies cut open in the name of gene seed implantation and black carapace grafting. Entire strata of a society can vanish into the holds of the fleet, their disappearance written up as a line of administratum doublespeak that hides the reality of mass abduction and quiet genocide. To Imperial commanders who have never seen them, the Carcharodons exist as almost mythic bogeymen. Old compliance records speak of their arrival like a storm, the sudden appearance of shark-toothed prows in the Auspex glare, the blooming of drop pods and attack craft. The Vox fills with clipped orders in Low Gothic and Binharic cant. Then there is only silence, and the screams of whatever the reef sharks have been pointed at. Even loyal worlds fear being placed on their path. A plea for aid can end with a world saved from one enemy, only to be bled dry to feed another. Officially, they are loyal. They bear the sigils of the Adeptus Astartes. Their colors are recorded in the litanies of the Adeptus Terra. Yet compliance logs and inquisitorial margins hint at something older and more feral lurking beneath the grey ceramite. Spectral fleets that vanish for whole centuries. Compliance actions where populations drop by half in the wake of their passage. A compliance seal and a neat red stamp closing the file, as if that is all that is required to bury what happened. For a long time, they were little more than that in the wider lore. Space Sharks, a nickname that stuck to an otherwise barely sketched chapter. Predators in grey, notable for their brutality and their lack of ties to any visible fortress monastery. Background predators that could be slotted into any war zone as needed, toothy and convenient. Then, slowly, the Tithe acquired a body. The trilogy of tales that bear their name, Red Tithe, Outer Dark, Void Exile, do not suddenly make the Carcharodons friendly or comprehensible. What they do is turn them from a joke name and a vague reputation into a fully realized culture of killers. You see them at work on Tithe worlds and in the guts of Void Hulks. You see the way they move through their own fleet, the way mortal serfs flinch and avert their eyes, the way their chaplains and officers discuss duty and extinction. The humor, such as it is black as the void. Their myths are older than any written chronicle within the story is allowed to admit. You learn of curses that run in their blood and haunt their souls. Blindness that comes not as a random infirmity, but as a sentence. Veteran warriors whose eyes cloud and darken as something in their gene code or in the warp's gaze turns against them. They are not pensioned off or pitied. They become void exiles, answering an inexorable call into self-imposed exile at the edges of the fleet, on missions that look a lot like penance and a little like self-destruction. It is a kind of gene and psychic doom that says everything about this chapter's place in the wider setting. They are forever on the knife edge between loyal duty and becoming something that even the Imperium would hesitate to call human. Their tools fit that reality. The Carcharodons are not a codex-perfect chapter with neat companies of uniform plate. They fight with what they have and what they can take, and they make everything they touch into a weapon. Leviathan dreadnoughts lumber through their holds, ancient and overbuilt even by the standards of those walking coffins. Contemptors like ancient Itako are described less like noble relics and more like chained sea monsters, their hulls covered in ritual scars, their machine spirits barely restrained behind layers of iron and litany. Armor marks from forgotten campaigns sit alongside scavenged Mechanicus constructs and repurposed enemy war gear. The chapter literally staples whatever works together into kill engines, then throws those engines into the thickest part of the fight. It is ugly. It is effective. It is very much in character. The way they sustain this arsenal is through arrangements that most upright Imperial servants would rather not examine too closely. Grey tithes are the shadow transactions that keep the sharks fed. On paper, these are exchanges between a loyal chapter and branches of the Mechanicus or local authorities. Material and data flow one way, services and flesh flow the other. In practice, they are meetings in the shadow of reactor stacks, under the watchful augmetic eyes of magi, who are just as compromised as the predators they deal with. Resources and relics are traded for extermination campaigns, or for simply looking the other way, while the Carcharodons take what they need from a world. Such dealings put the nomad predation fleets in constant orbit around forge worlds and other nodes of Adeptus Mechanicus power. They stalk the borders of Magos-dominated systems, dock at outlying manufacturer, walk the steel streets of industrial hells, where the red-robed priesthood rules in the Omnissiah's name. They fight for the Mechanicus, with the Mechanicus, and, when necessary, against splinters of it. Their grey tithes are as much about permission as they are about supply. So long as the ledgers look balanced, the priesthood tolerates their presence, allows their gene-forged horrors to prowl the unlit routes between stars, without too many questions being asked. That constant proximity to the clans of Mars and its children carries its own risks. The Adeptus Mechanicus is a hydra of dogmas and heresies, and the line between loyal Magos and dark Mechanicus heretic is a thin one out in the wastes of the galaxy. A chapter that spends its days docked at the edges of such power, trading favors with those who catalog forbidden relics and warp-tainted artifacts, is always going to be brushing up against the dangerous fringes of imperial politics, hidden pacts, experimental technology, quarantined data that should have been purged. It is exactly the sort of environment where a heretic plot can take root, and where corrupted constructs like the rust stalkers that turned on Tyberos can be primed and launched. The rupture of the Great Rift and the dawn of the Indomitus era did not suddenly civilize the Carcharodons. They did, however, drag them into sharper contact with a wider imperium that is itself thrashing. In the dark, the galaxy is split. The Astronomican's light is scarred. Primaris reinforcements, forged in secrets on Mars and delivered by the will of the returned Primarch, spread like a pale flame through the chapters of the Adeptus Astartes. Even the sharks in the outer dark cannot remain untouched. Primaris warriors, taller and denser of gene-wrought muscle, appear in the ranks of the nomad predation fleet. New armor marks, new tactical expectations, new litanies. The contact pressure of fighting alongside more conventional forces, of being named and invoked in the same breath as other chapters, begins to press upon their ancient, feral culture. You see it in the way the newer stories handle them. Guard regiments and battle groups of the Astra Militarum now meet Carcharodon's warriors not as half-remembered ghosts, but as brutal allies operating under the same broken sky. Other chapters cross their path, bearing the sigils of Guilliman's crusade. Mechanicus forces arrive not just as Tithe partners, but as full allies in desperate campaigns along the rift's edges. Primaris technology, with all its implications of renewal and control, finds its way into the grey armories. Every one of those points of contact erodes a fraction of the isolation that once defined the nomad predation fleets. The Carcharodons respond to this intrusion into their old patterns as they respond to everything, with pragmatic brutality. They take in Primaris recruits, but they do so on their own terms, grafting new flesh onto old rituals. They accept the demands of crusade where necessary, but they keep to their own currents as much as they can. Their curses do not go away because the galaxy has changed. The blindness that calls their veterans into exile still blooms in blood-clouded eyes. The Void exiles still answer that call, slipping away on missions that may or may not be sanctioned, carrying with them the chapter's oldest sins. This is the state of the sharks when Tyberos is maimed on that forge world. Not as a static artifact trapped under glass, untouched by the tides of history, but as the apex of a chapter in the middle of a violent, reluctant mutation. Old firstborn predators share decks with newly forged Primaris brothers. Leviathan Dreadnoughts that walked wars older than any living mortal now stride alongside fresh constructs whose machine spirits barely know their own names. The Nicor carries curses and reinforcements in the same hold. The chapter's dealings with the Mechanicus are deeper and more fraught than ever. Their role in the Outer Dark is more vital and more compromised. If you were going to do something radical with a chapter master, this is when you would do it. Not in the quiet lull between editions, not in some sealed-off theatre of war that no one else sees, but at a moment when every decision has the potential to ripple outwards. To change Tyberos now is to fix or further warp the direction in which the Carcharodons evolve. To entomb him, to elevate him, or to replace him is to decide what sort of predators the Imperium wants, stalking its margins in the Age of the Rift. Before we can follow that decision to its end, before we can talk seriously about what it would mean for the Shadelord to rise again as a Dreadnought, we have to look squarely at what that word means in this universe, not as a line in an army list or a weight of resin in a collector's hand, but as a fate. A Dreadnought is not a bigger suit of armor. It is a sentence, a living damnation nailed into iron, dragged back from the edge of death for the convenience and terror of a galaxy that refuses to let its finest killers rest. The sharks of the Outer Dark already chain such coffins in their holds. The question hanging in the void now is whether they intend to nail their lord into one. There is a persistent ghost in the way people talk about Tyberos. It hangs around the edges of old forum arguments and half-remembered articles, a little misunderstanding that grew teeth over the years. You can hear it in the way some voices describe him, like they are talking about something more than a space marine in overbuilt plate, as if the Reaper Lord is literally stomping around the void in a cut-down Dreadnought chassis, a sarcophagus with legs and lightning claws. That image is wrong, but it did not come from nowhere. The seed of the confusion lies in the name stamped onto his armor. Tactical Dreadnought armor, in a setting where that phrase has been shortened for generations to simply Terminator plate. It is easy to forget how it sounds when you hear all the words laid out. Tactical Dreadnought armor, a giant who already rivals a Dreadnought for sheer presence, wrapped in something officially named for Dreadnoughts, sculpted by Forge World as a hulking brute with armor that looks like it could shrug off starship weaponry. It is not hard to see how some minds made an intuitive leap. They looked at the resin model, at the broad chest and heavy shoulders, at the way the plates flare and stack, and they did not see a Marine in heavy armor. They saw a Dreadnought wearing a Marine. In truth, Tyberos is not a sarcophagus on legs. He is flesh and ceramite. His warplate is tactical Dreadnought armor pushed toward an extreme, a Terminator suit that has been amended, reinforced and overgrown to the point where it brushes up against that old name and makes the mistake feel almost reasonable. In lore terms, his armor is described in the language of slabs and layers, rather than graceful curves. Grey ceramite plates, already thick by standard patterns, have been built up with extra strata, each one bolted or riveted into the next. Beneath the ceramic shell, plasteel backing and adamantium reinforcement rods form a skeleton within a skeleton, a structural cage to hold in something that has grown beyond the expectations of the artificers who first fashioned it, brass studs and shark tooth. Trophies sprout from surfaces that on other suits would be smooth. Trophy bones hang from chains, rattling softly with every step. The helm is often described with that boar-snouted predatory cast, snout vents flared like the muzzle of some abyssal animal sniffing for blood. It is war gear as reliquary and as executioner. Each plate carries the scored memories of previous wars, scratches that reached down to the plasteel core and were filled, but never smoothed entirely. Aquilae and chapter sigils half buried under new armor segments, like old scars under fresh burns. It is easy, looking at descriptions and miniatures, to glimpse the trajectory. Add a few more layers. Replace the helm with a full sarcophagus front. Bolt on heavier limb housings. The gulf between this and a true Dreadnought shell begins to feel more like a gradient than a clear line. The weapons grafted into that image are no less significant. Hunger and Slake, the paired lightning claws that have become as much a symbol of Tyberos as the Nikor's toothy prow, are not neat catalogue items from the armories of Mars. Their pattern and manufacture are explicitly unknown, even to the Magi who pride themselves on knowing every stamp and serial number the Mechanicus has ever issued. They are veteran monsters in their own right. Each gauntlet is more than a glove with blades attached. The housings are bulky, plated, studded with sensor nodules and rune-etched control studs. The claws themselves are long, barbed talons, each one containing within its length a mess of internal mechanisms that give rise to the accounts of them literally chewing through armor. When they engage, the claws are wreathed in crackling fields that explode anything softer than adamantium into charred fragments. Beneath that visible effect, machine-toothed motors and biting mechanisms turn, grinding and tearing at anything caught between their teeth. Flesh is shredded, ceramite bitten, bone and plasteel reduced to jagged. Shrapnel. Their names are not poetic exaggerations. They describe what the gauntlets do to anything unlucky enough to be on the receiving end. These claws are part of the confusion about Tyberos and Dreadnoughts as well. Dreadnoughts often carry their own brutal equivalents: siege claws, chain fists, weapons that squash tanks and tear apart fortifications. Seeing a giant in tactical Dreadnought armor with overbuilt lightning claws that behave more like compact siege implements makes him feel like a bridge between recognizable marine and walking coffin. The account of a Tithe of Shadows takes this already blurred image and drives a rust-stalker blade straight through it. In that ambush on the Forge World, the Sicarian constructs do not merely mark his armor or leave a few new scars across the grey. They destroy his warplate. The text makes that clear. The tactical Dreadnought armor that has carried Tyberos through the Badab War and through uncounted nameless compliance actions in the outer dark is torn open, cracked at the seams, punctured and ruined. Systems fail, plates shatter. The cage of plasteel and adamantium that kept his titanic frame alive and moving in environments that should kill anything is rendered non-functional. The story is careful, though, in what it says next. It tells you the armor is destroyed. It tells you Tyberos is gravely wounded. It tells you that the Carcharodons respond with the violence you would expect, that the dark Mechanicus presence behind the attack is exposed and punished. It does not tell you what happens to Hunger and Slake. It does not linger on a scene of a shattered claw lying on the deck, nor does it reassure you that the gauntlets are recovered and placed reverently in some vault. Their fate is left as a deliberate gap. That gap is a weapon in its own right. It is a narrative gun set on the table, in full view of anyone paying attention. At some point, that weapon will either be picked up and fired or carefully lifted away, unused. Either way, the fact that it was there will color how we read whatever comes after. If you strip the red wake of his armor and of the claws that have defined his silhouette, you are not just wounding a character, you are breaking a mask. War in this universe is filled with these ritual masks. Chaplains, whose skull helms and Crozius arcanums define their authority. Librarians whose hooded cowls and psychic hoods mark them out as trusted witch killers. Captains whose crested helms and artificer plate make them walking battle standards. Tyberos is the mask of the Carcharodons. His warplate and his claws are the visible expression of the chapter's self-image as primed predator. To see him without them is like seeing a beloved saint without his halo and attributes, or like staring at an inquisitor with no rosette and no retinue, just an aging man in plain cloth. Thematically, the destruction of his armor and the questionable survival of Hunger and Slake say that the chapter cannot continue to wear that old face unaltered. The executioner's hood has been ripped aside in the middle of the act. Something new must be fashioned if the ritual is to continue. Two obvious paths open when you imagine the artificers and apothecaries standing over Tyberos's broken form. The first is the forging of a new suit of warplate, something even more monstrous. Perhaps a set of Terminator armor designed to accommodate a Primaris enhanced frame, taller and denser, with new systems grafted in, a walking engine of the Indomitus age that still carries the old shark teeth trophies and the names of extinct campaigns etched along its rims. Perhaps that armor incorporates whatever remains of Hunger and Slake, their mechanisms rebuilt, their housings grafted into a new pattern. In this path, the Reaper Lord walks again in ceramite, still a man of meat inside the machine, but altered, escalated, visibly changed in a way that reflects the wider pressures dragging the Carcharodons into the era of Primaris and the Rift. The second path is not an upgrade, it is an escalation into horror. Tyberos's injuries might be judged too severe for any amount of graft and augmentation to restore him to full function even in a Primaris body. The only way to keep his experience and murderous instinct on the board is to inter him. The surgeons and tech marines would carve away what is left of his ruined limbs, slide what remains of his body into a sarcophagus, flood it with amniotic slurry, and weld it shut. From there, cables and plugs would tie that coffin into a Dreadnought chassis, perhaps a Leviathan pattern to suit his scale, perhaps some hybrid monster that the Magi of the Grey Tithes have been itching to assemble. Hunger and Slake, or their echoes, would be mounted as full Dreadnought weapons, great rending claws that crush tanks and bastions instead of individual men. In that scenario, the old rumors become true by a cruel route. Tyberos would not have been a Dreadnought in the time when people thought he was. He would become one now, because some treacherous rust stalkers and a dark Mechanicus infiltrator tore open the armor that kept him free. Stories in this setting love to nail identity to armor in this way. Think of the venerable ancients whose sarcophagi have become shrines. Bjorn the Fell-Handed, a hero entombed since the days of the Great Crusade, whose Dreadnought shell is both weapon and relic. Cullen, who went from chapter master in flesh to Leviathan in iron, his wars etched into every meter of his hull. Even nameless chapter dreads, who have slept for centuries between battles, their sarcophagi bearing inscriptions that entire companies recite as litanies. In each case, the armor is not just protection, it is a fossil. It carries forward the record of previous wars, scars layered over scars, relic plate bolted onto newer structures until the machine itself tells a story. Tyberos's tactical Dreadnought armor has always felt like the beginning of such a fossil. Overgrown, layered, more reliquary than standard issue, it already reads like a proto-tomb wrapped around a still-living predator. Taking it away is not a random aesthetic adjustment. It is the removal of a shell that was already beginning to resemble a coffin. It clears the space for a new shell to be built, whether that shell is a Primaris-sized cage of ceramite and shark teeth, or a full Dreadnought chassis whose bulk would turn him into a literal iron reef stalker. Whatever choice the chapter and the writers make, the break is the necessary prelude. You cannot rebirth a monster without first killing the old image of it. Before we follow that rebirth into precise speculation, before we decide whether the next time we hear the name Tyberos, it will be attached to an overbuilt suit of Mark X plate, or etched along the flank of a Leviathan, we need to face what that second option really is. Dreadnoughts are not just larger marines. They are not simply cool units with more guns. They are engines of suffering, coffins given limbs, bits of once-living warriors wired into machines that exist only to kill and to remember. To ask whether the Red Wake is becoming a Dreadnought is to ask whether the Carcharodons are willing to nail their mask into iron and condemn their Shade Lord to a half-life of weaponized torment. When an Astartes is broken beyond the reach of even his gene-forged resilience, when his spine is shattered, his organs ruined, and his limbs mangled into useless meat, the Imperium does not always allow him the mercy of death. A battle brother who has killed enough in the Emperor's name, is too valuable to waste. In such cases, the chapter's chaplains and tech marines may offer him a different fate. He is not retired. He is not laid to rest in a tomb beneath the fortress monastery. He is cut down to what can be kept alive and sealed inside an iron coffin. That coffin is wired into a walking engine of war, surrounded by ceramite, hydraulics, and guns. That engine is called a Dreadnought. The word has weight in every chapter's litany. It is painted with honorifics, carved into marble, chanted by serfs as something holy. To serve as a Dreadnought, they say, is to be given a second life in eternal battle. The old warrior does not age. He does not wither in some infirmary. He fights on. His wisdom guides the younger brethren. His guns and iron fists crush the enemies of mankind. That is the version a chaplain might give to a neophyte, voice rising in the reverb of a chapel. Strip away the cloaking of ritual, and what remains is horror. The interment process begins with amputation. Everything that cannot be salvaged is removed. Limbs are severed. Wrecked bone is cut away. Ruined organs are excised. What is left is a torso and head, as much as can still cling to biological function. That remnant is lowered into a sarcophagus, a metal casket whose inner walls are lined with plugs, needles, and nerve spikes. The tech marines flood the interior with amniotic fluid to cradle flesh that can no longer support itself. Cables bite into spine and brain. Sensorium feeds are stitched into optic nerves and auditory centers. The warrior's own eyes may be taken, replaced with lenses and augmetics that relay what the machine sees. His nerve endings do not forget how to scream. Old wounds ache. Phantom limbs burn with remembered damage. On top of that, the sarcophagus feeds him a constant stream of machine-borne sensation. Auspex data, vox traffic, targeting runes ghosting across what is left of his vision. The machine spirit's moods rumble along his spine like distant thunder. When he moves, he feels not muscles tightening and relaxing, but hydraulic pistons engaging, servos whining, steel joints grinding through their arcs. When he is hit, the impact shudders through armor and frame, and somewhere in the slurry that holds his ruined body, his damaged bones feel it too. Most of the time, he does not feel anything at all. Dreadnoughts sleep between wars, not because their chapters are kind, but because they have to. The constructs are ancient and temperamental. The minds inside them are older and more brittle still. To keep them conscious would be to watch them fray and snap under the strain. So they are shut down. Their sarcophagi are sealed with final litanies. Power to their higher functions is cut. They are left in crypts, watched over by tech marines and skull-faced chaplains, slumbering in alcoves that shake with the distant roll of macro cannon fire. When the chapter needs them, the sarcophagi are awoken. Power is restored. Litanies of ignition and awakening are chanted over the sarcophagus and the frame around it. Machine spirits surge. Sensors come alive. The mind inside the coffin claws its way back to consciousness. For many of them, that waking is agony. They come up through layers of half-remembered battles and dormancy, unsure which century it is, which war, which enemy. Voices they have not heard for whole human lifetimes echo in their skull. For a moment, or for several, they may speak names long dead, shout warnings about assaults that happened thousands of years before. Some never quite adjust. They lumber through current wars haunted by ghosts of previous ones, a palimpsest of conflicts all written over each other in their neural pathways. The younger brothers who fight alongside them see only the iron. They hear the booming voices, the venerable counsel and the sudden rages. They do not feel the claustrophobia that must gnaw at a mind that can never stretch its limbs, that can never again feel air on its skin or the weight of its own body without armor. They honor the Dreadnought as a living relic, as they have been taught. They do not dwell on the fact that he is also a prisoner. Among the Carcharodons, Dreadnoughts are treated less like relics and more like chained war beasts. The nomad predation. Fleets do not have the luxury of politeness. They keep what works, and their dreadnoughts work very well. Ancient Itako is one such construct, an old warrior whose chassis looms like a fortress, even among the lumbering iron of other chapters. He reads more like a leviathan than a standard contemptor, a colossal frame whose every step is a quake through deck plating. When the Carcharodons decide that a culture is not worth integrating, not worth tithing, that it must instead be pulped and rendered down into rubble and fertilizer for the void, they send in Itako and others like him. These dreadnoughts are the chapter's bluntest instruments. Drop them from orbit into the heart of a hive that has displeased the ledger, and they will walk through hab blocks and manufacturer like a slow-moving extinction event. Tanks are simply obstacles to crush. Emplacements are things to wade through. The warrior inside that iron coffin may once have been a precise blade. Now he is a hammer. The chapter unleashes him with the same lack of sentiment with which it tallies up population losses and gene seed gains. A force that already treats human populations as tithe stock, as raw material to be sorted into categories of neophyte, servitor, or waste, does not balk at chaining its own honored heroes into walking tombs. If anything, they would see it as efficient. The old warrior gets to keep killing. The chapter retains his experience and his murderous instincts. The fact that his existence has been reduced to a sequence of painful awakenings and long, dark sleeps in some underdeck crypt would barely register in the calculus of a fleet that thinks in terms of planetary harvests rather than individual feelings. You can see why there is a certain poetic symmetry in the idea that Tyberos might follow that path. For years, he has been the apex predator of the Carcharodons, the massive silhouette at the head of every notable action. To imagine that mass of controlled violence cut down and welded into an even larger frame is to imagine a kind of completion. Fans speak of the notion half in dread and half in dark fascination. The term Leviathan hangs in the air. So does the word Megalodon, that ancient predatory shape from old Terra's oceans. A custom pattern. Dreadnought, a megalodon of the void, with Tyberos' sarcophagus bolted into its chest and a pair of vast crushing claws echoing hunger and slake on its arms, is an image that fits the chapter almost obscenely well. An iron shark amidst the stars. Consider what that would do to the man inside. Tyberos is defined, as far as we ever see him, by control. His brutality is measured, not rabid. He does not shriek or howl. His orders are few words, quietly spoken, but absolute. When he walks into a battle, there is a sense that nothing he does is random. He chooses where to apply his claws. He chooses when to hold back. He is, above all, a hunter who decides when and where to strike. His silence is not emptiness, but discipline. Interment would be a direct assault on that control. No matter how strong his will, he would wake inside a box he cannot leave, inside a machine that cannot ever truly rest. The wars he has fought, the exterminations he has ordered, the populations he has tithed and culled, all of that would echo through him as he was forced to relive them in memory and in the distortions of the sarcophagus's drug-drenched half-sleep. Every time the tech marines keyed his sarcophagus back to full consciousness and fed power into the frame, he would be dragged up through that mire, feeling the machine's spirit's moods gnaw at his temper. Would the discipline hold? Would the Reaper Lord remain the cold, silent authority he has always appeared to be, speaking only when needed, killing with precision through limbs of steel? Or would centuries of confinement grind his mind down, leave him more like the howling ancients in other chapters' crypts, raging at shadows only he can see, lashing out at enemies that died before the great rift tore the sky? The Carcharodons' chaplains would watch for that, of course. They might welcome a certain level of fury. They would not tolerate a loss of usefulness. In their ledger, madness that cannot be harnessed is waste. Other dreadnoughts in the wider Adeptus Astartes show the range of what this fate can do to a mind. Bjorn, the fell-handed, oldest of the Space Wolves, is a relic whose memory stretches back to the days when the Emperor walked among his sons. He is a living continuity for his chapter, able, when awake and lucid, to speak of the Great Crusade as if it were yesterday. Cullen of the Red Scorpions, reborn in a massive Leviathan shell, carries the doctrines and grudges of an entire region of space locked inside his iron ribs. Even nameless ancients serve as walking archives, their sarcophagi covered in carved campaigns, their fragmented recollections pulled on by librarians who need to know how some long-forgotten enemy once died. Tyberos as a dreadnought would be the same, and worse. He would be a memory core of the outer dark, caverns of extermination, and grey tithes stored in a brain that can no longer do anything but recall and murder. He would remember worlds no one else even knows ever existed, cultures that were quietly erased and filed as tithes paid. His recollections would be of cities being harvested, of compliance actions conducted without witnesses, of pacts made in furnace-lit Mechanicus chambers, where the air tasted of oil and betrayal. Every time he woke, those memories would come with him. Is that a promotion for a chapter that values the hunt and the kill above all? Is it a mercy, in their terms, to allow their lord to keep doing what he was made to do, even if it means subjecting him to an eternity of being drowned and dragged back over and over? Or is it a punishment, a sentence of endless awareness strapped to a machine that exists only to be pointed at? Enemies, and fired until it breaks. The Carcharodons are not a sentimental people. They are not likely to frame it as punishment on any parchment. They would call it honor, duty, continuation. They would tell their neophytes that this is what awaits those who serve perfectly, that their wars will not end with their flesh. They may even believe it, but somewhere in the quiet depths of a dreadnought crypt, with the power down and only the faint humming of life support remaining, the mind inside the sarcophagus knows exactly what has been taken from it. With that understanding of what a dreadnought truly is, the image of Tyberos bleeding on a forge world takes on new edges. A broken suit of tactical dreadnought armor, a body shattered but not yet gone, an attack engineered by corrupted Mechanicus assets. The story stops short of the surgery bays, leaving us with the shape of the wound and the knowledge of what options exist for a warrior in that state. The question now is whether that shape feels like bait set for a future dreadnought, a wound inflicted precisely to justify nailing the red wake into iron, or whether the Primaris path, with all its own agonies, is more likely. To answer that, we have to go back to the scene in a Tithe of Shadows and examine not just that he was hurt, but how, where, and by whom. The wound that changes everything does not open on a battlefield that anyone had marked on their star charts as important. It opens in the kind of place where the Imperium hides its necessary sins. An obscure forge world in the outer dark, one more industrial blister on the skin of a dying empire, its skies clogged with smoke and its ground drowned in steel. There, under the weight of chimneys and spires, a grey tithe is due. Grey tithes sit in the cracks between official doctrine and the black ledgers that only certain magi and certain chapter serfs ever see. On the surface, they are transactions like any other tithe. Resources recorded, signatures exchanged, seals impressed, the Omnissiah and the Emperor invoked in rote phrases. In truth, they are half-sanctioned arrangements, where a nomad predation chapter trades the kind of work that cannot be spoken of aloud for the kind of materiel that should not be moving through official supply chains. The Carcharodons bring exterminations and silence. The Adeptus Mechanicus brings ammunition, armor, gene stock, forbidden patterns, and now Primaris technology. Everyone looks down at the ledger and pretends not to see the blood soaking in around the edges. It is into this atmosphere of strained courtesy and quiet threat that Tyberos and his chosen brothers descend. The forge world that hosts them is a study in machine devotion. Towering spires vanish into the polluted cloud cover, their flanks alive with conveyor lines, plasma venting, and the stuttering glow of lumen arrays sacrificed long ago to efficiency. Vast manufactura beat like iron hearts, pumping out weapons and shells and servitor components by the million. Vox choirs drone binary hymns into the sky. Every surface is stamped with the sigils of the Omnissiah, every corridor patrolled by Skitarii and servitors, whose flesh has long since been pared down to what is strictly necessary. Into that ordered nightmare walk the sharks of the outer dark. Their grey armour seems almost muted against the red and brass of the Mechanicus host, but there is nothing subtle about their presence. They move in silence, eyes behind helms tracking every gun tower and every robed figure. The air seems to grow thinner where they pass. Behind and around Tyberos, the Red Brethren in their tactical Dreadnought plate are mobile bunkers, each one a wall of ceramite and shark-tooth trophies. At their head, the Reaper Lord's bulk swallows light, his boar-snouted helm turning slightly as he reads the flow of the reception with a predator's dispassionate awareness. The greeting is ceremonial, at least on the surface. A procession of Sicarian rust-stalkers advances to meet the chapter master, blades held low in something that could be read as a salute. Incense coils around their segmented limbs, masking the tang of oils and hot metal. Their optics burn in the murk like baleful stars. Red-robed priests chant a litany of welcome, data prayers rolling from their vox augmentations in harmonized streams. Names and titles are exchanged. The niceties of alliance are observed. The ledger must be honored. On some level, everyone understands that this is theater, but the Imperium runs on such theater. Symbols matter. Ritual holds the rotting thing together. Then the symbols turn. Without so much as a stutter in their marching rhythm, the rust-stalkers pivot. Incense spills in sudden disordered clouds as their blades snap up, not in salute, but in killing arcs. The binary cant coming from their vox implants shifts from greeting to something harsher, a machine code invocation of targeting spirits and combat routines. Their movements are not the erratic rush of lesser assassins. They are precise, engineered, horrifyingly efficient. In a heartbeat, the honor guard becomes an execution squad. They do not strike at the escorting terminators. They do not sweep their blades out in a generalized attempt to butcher whichever Astartes stand closest. Every motion is aimed squarely at Tyberos. This is the brutality of the choice. Rust-stalkers are not line infantry with upgraded legs. They are assassin augmetics, built from the ground up to be surgical instruments of the Omnissiah's will. Their bodies are stripped down, all unnecessary mass and redundant structure excised. In their place are hyper-jointed limbs, stealth systems, and an obscene array of cutting implements and neurotoxin dispensers. They go where they are pointed, and they unmake whatever stands in the way. To devote such a cadre to a single target is to acknowledge the threat that target represents. The Forge world has not rolled out a parade. It has rolled out a scalpel to carve up a monster. Blades bite into ceramite. Fields of disruptive energy designed to peel open armor flash and coruscate along Tyberos' warplate. Joints are targeted, weak points sought within human focus. Rust-stalkers race up his front, along his arms, around behind him, moving with a spider-like disregard for the usual planes of motion. Blades clatter off adamantium reinforcement, shear through layers of plate, slip between seals. Toxins hiss from needle ports, seeking flesh beneath the armor with eager malignancy. The attack is meant not to mark or test, but to cripple, to take the Reaper Lord apart faster than even an Astartes nervous system can respond. The fact that he does respond is testament to what he is. Accounts of the event make it clear that the Rust Stalkers pay the full price of their deployment. The Red Brethren are not idle. Bolt rounds roar in enclosed spaces. Power fists swing. Ceramite-shod boots crush delicate augmentics. Tyberos himself lashes out with claws and crushing gauntlets, turning the glossy forms of his attackers into sprayed fragments and sparking scrap. The floor runs slick. Incense turns to acrid smoke. The welcome hall becomes an abattoir, but the cost is catastrophic. By the time the last Rust Stalker falls, Tyberos's tactical Dreadnought armor is wreckage still wrapped around a bleeding core. Plates have been punched in, flayed open, or entirely removed. Power systems hang in sparking, severed loops. Hydraulic lines vent precious fluids. Warning runes flood his helm's display, then gutter and die as subsystems overload and fail. Somewhere in all of that, amidst the destroyed plate and shattered reinforcement, the flesh of the chapter master takes wounds that even his overbuilt physiology cannot shrug off. The Red Brethren who reach him have fought beside him long enough to know what he can ordinarily endure. The narrative makes a point of their shock. For warriors raised among a fleet that harvests worlds, for killers for whom horror is routine, to be shaken at the sight of one battered figure says everything. They see not just damage to ceramite. They see depth of cuts, pallor of exposed flesh, the sluggishness of movement. They see their lord close to a death that no one had thought likely. The revelation of why the assassination was possible comes in the aftermath. The Rust Stalkers were not acting under loyal command. They had been suborned, their protocols warped and rewritten by a hidden presence in the Forge World's priesthood. A dark Mechanicus tech priest, a heretic whose soul is rusted through beneath his crimson robes, had nested himself deep in the hierarchy, waiting for a chance to turn the machinery of the Omnissiah against one of the Emperor's most frightening hounds. The exact motives of this corruption are left murky, as befits any truly dangerous infection. Was it simple hatred of the Carcharodons? A broader gambit in some war of data? And demons across the maelstrom and beyond? An attempt to destabilize grey Tithe arrangements that others rely upon? The story does not condescend to explain. What it makes very clear is that this was no random accident and no isolated betrayal. A grey Tithe world is, by definition, a node in the hidden arterial system that keeps the nomad predation fleet supplied. It is a place where resources and knowledge flow in directions that do not appear on official charts. If such a place can harbor dark Mechanicus influence powerful enough to weaponize Rust Stalkers against a chapter master, then the whole circulatory system is suspect. The Carcharodons have relied on these arrangements to acquire replacement war gear, to access patterns that would otherwise be denied to a chapter of their origins, and now to secure Primaris reinforcements and the knowledge to maintain them. If that lifeline is compromised, then every grey Tithe becomes a potential ambush. Every approach to a Forge world could conceal a heretic plot.
Be sure to subscribe. You know you want to. If you don't, you'll be sent into the void and nobody will find you for the rest of your life. So go. Be sure to subscribe. Remember, subscribe.
Every servo skull, every Skitarius, every Mechanicus engine might be carrying more than just the Omnissiah's will in its processes. Tyberos's near death on that Forge world is not just a personal catastrophe. It is a warning shot across the bows of the entire nomad predation pattern. It also marks him out, specifically as a target in the shadow war that spreads through the Maelstrom region and the broader Indomitus age. Plenty of enemies would profit from the removal of a chapter master who specializes in making problems disappear. Traitor warbands, Xenos polities, rival imperial power blocks, discontent factions within the Mechanicus itself, all have reason to fear a silent compliance fleet that owes allegiance to no local governor and no commander, but its own ledger. Turning the machinery of a grey Tithe against Tyberos is an elegant move, using his own supply chain as the knife. For all of that, the Reaper Lord does not die. The record is unambiguous on that point. He outlives his attackers. The hidden Dark Mechanicus presence is dragged into the light and burned there. The Rust Stalkers are reduced to scrap and scattered organics. The immediate threat is neutralized in the only way the Carcharodons ever neutralize anything, thoroughly. What remains of Tyberos, however, is a ruin. His armor is not merely damaged, it is declared destroyed. The suit that has followed him through the Badab War and the unnamed exterminations of the Outer Dark is no longer salvageable as a functioning shell. The body inside is left broken and poisoned, wounds deep enough that even those raised in the cult of the flesh shark stare and wonder how his heart still beat. The narrative does not give you a comfortable scene of apothecaries working miracles. It does not walk you through the medica rites that follow. It stops on the image of a giant brought low. It is just as precise in what it chooses not to show or say as in what it does. The extent of Tyberos's injuries is not catalogued. You are not told which limbs are lost, which organs hang by threads, which augmentics have failed beyond repair. The fate of Hunger and Slake, those emblematic claws, is left entirely unspoken. Were they shattered with the armor? Were they wrenched from his hands in the frenzy? Were they left clamped in the wreckage of some Rust Stalker's torso, their mechanisms still grinding like teeth long after the fight ended? There is no line confirming that they have been safely stowed, no description of them lying on an altar, awaiting reforging. That absence is loud. Readers steeped in the lore recognized it immediately for what it is. You do not take a cult favorite figure, one whose appearances have been carefully rationed over years, and maim him this extensively in a limited edition account, merely to add color to an otherwise unrelated tale. You do not pick that character in that context on that kind of secretive publication if your goal is simply to show that even mighty warriors can suffer ambushes. The very containment of the story, bound to a special edition of a later work, suggests deliberation. This is groundwork laid where only the most attentive and invested will initially see it, ready to be referenced more publicly later. In that light, the details the story refuses to give become more important than the ones it does. The missing inventory of wounds, the silence around the claws, the abrupt halt before any reconstruction is discussed, all of it is space left open for later decisions. Do they cross him over into Primaris form, justifying the surgery with the excuse of catastrophic injury? Do they inter him, sliding what remains of him into a sarcophagus and forging a dreadnought around it? Do they let the name Tyberos pass on as a title to another butcher, with the original entombed somewhere in the depths of the Nicor, as a secret the Outer Dark will never be told? Whatever path they choose, it will not be quiet. The manner of his near death guarantees that. This is not a wound taken on some nameless battlefield against some faceless Xenos foe. It is a strike delivered through the Mechanicus, on a world that exists to facilitate the very grey tithes that keep the Carcharodons moving. It is a betrayal executed by constructs that should have been the purest expressions of the machine cult's loyalty. It cuts deep into the trust network that the chapter relies upon far more than any fortress monastery. It is, to borrow an old metaphor, a knife slipped between the ribs, angled not just at the heart of one man, but at the entire circulatory system of a predatory fleet. You do not pick that knife at random. When the first whispers of a tithe of shadows began to spread, they did not carry full summaries or sanctioned synopses. They carried fragments, a forge world, an ambush, Rust Stalkers turning on their supposed allies, Tyberos standing, barely, amidst wreckage that used to be, his armor. From those fragments, the questions grew. In the shadowed corners of the lore, among men who have followed the sharks of the Outer Dark from their first vague mentions to the trilogy of their own, a kind of unspoken arithmetic took shape. Most gave the Primaris path as the likeliest outcome. In the age of the Indomitus Crusade, with the Great Rift tearing the galaxy into bleeding halves, the return of the Primarch has meant many things, but for the Adeptus Astartes, it has meant one thing above all. Primaris, taller, stronger, newer. Chapters across the Imperium have been forced, gently or otherwise, to graft this new breed onto their old cultures. The Carcharodons are no exception. Grey Tithes and other half-hidden arrangements have already delivered Primaris gene stock and war gear into their holds. To take a chapter master who has been shattered almost beyond saving and push him across the Rubicon is, on paper, brutally logical. The body is already ruined. The risk is already present. The age expects Primaris leadership. The ledger writes itself. Behind that, close enough to breathe down its neck, lurks the Dreadnought option. Tyberos as interred engine. Leviathan shell or some yet unnamed pattern. A megalodon of iron cruising through vacuum with the red wake welded into its chest. His injuries, as described, could easily be spun as beyond the reach of even the most extreme Primaris grafting. Not every corpse can be inflated into a new demigod. There are limits, even to gene-wrought miracles. Where those limits are reached, the sarcophagus waits. Far behind these two, like dim phantoms at the horizon, stand the simpler possibilities. He survives more or less as he was, patched together, given new plate and a few extra scars, and the next time his name appears, it is as if nothing much happened beyond some color text about his brush with assassination. Or he dies. Off-page, between stories, the Reaper Lord succumbs to wounds taken in the dark of a Tithe hall that most Imperial citizens will never even know exists. The chapter names a new master, paints his armor the proper grey, and the Nicor sails on under the same toothy prow. The spread is clear. Primaris Tyberos as the dominant expectation, Dreadnought Tyberos as the second, but drenched in a thicker, blacker hope or dread, depending on who is doing the imagining. Simple survival or quiet replacement, barely registering as more than technical possibilities. In universe, the Primaris route has the cold weight of the era behind it. The Rubicon Primaris is not a ceremony. It is a meat grinder dressed up in litanies. Marines who submit to it have their bodies torn open again, their gene seed reworked, new organs rammed into meat that is already scarred by centuries of war. Even for Astartes, there is a limit to how many times you can unmake and remake a body without losing something essential. Void Exile has already made a point of this. At least one brother of the Carcharodons dies attempting the crossing. His death is not treated as an accident in a clean process, but as further proof that every so-called gift in this age comes at a crooked price. Becoming Primaris is not a clean ascension. It is another chapter in the same old story of sacrifice and pain. From a purely practical perspective, a shattered Tyberos is a prime candidate. He is already on the slab. His armor is gone. His physiology, abused by poison and ruststalker blades, may never be what it was. If the chapter has the knowledge and the equipment to attempt the Rubicon, this is exactly when they would do it. They keep their apex predator in a form that can still walk among his brothers, still pace the decks of the Nicor under his own power, still descend in Terminator plate, or whatever monstrosity comes next. The wider Imperium gets what it wants to see. A chapter master whose silhouette matches the new approved pattern. Guilliman's servants can tick a box. The ledger stays full. The Carcharodons too might see a certain appeal. They are not sentimental about flesh. They are used to cutting and grafting, to harvesting and repurposing. A surgery that spits out a stronger killer at the other end, if it works, is in keeping with their grotesque utilitarianism. A Primaris Tyberos would be a visible symbol that even the sharks of the outer dark have been dragged, snarling, into the new Imperium. The Dreadnought route is narrower, but steeper. It begins with the assumption that his wounds are simply too much. There is not enough left to graft onto. Too many organs are ruined beyond reliable regeneration. The Rubicon, with its demand for a certain baseline of physical integrity, is closed. In that case, the only way to keep the Reaper Lord on the board is interment. The image is obscene and compelling. Tech Marines hauling his broken mass toward a sarcophagus. Chaplains intoning litanies over a coffin built to take a larger, more aberrant frame than any they have slotted before. Magi of the Mechanicus whispering Binharic arguments about frame patterns, while shark-toothed sergeants watch in silence. Then there is the chassis itself. The Carcharodons already favor heavy war engines for the work that words like raise and cleanse barely cover. Their leviathans and contemptors wade through enemy formations like predators through shoals. A dreadnought custom-built to house the Reaper Lord, a thing whose bulk pushes even Leviathan proportions, whose carapace could be carved with the scars of Maelstrom campaigns and Tithe worlds bled dry, would be more than a weapon. It would be a statement. A red wake engine, a shark of iron and salt ghosts, dropped from low orbit into the hearts of cultures that have been marked not for conquest, but for erasure. Within that iron prison, Tyberos' mind would become something new and old. A dreadnought does not simply add more guns to a life. It changes the very way that life exists. We have already walked through the horror of that in the previous chapter. Here the question becomes personal. Could the same control, the same measured brutality that has always defined him, survive centuries of amniotic half-dreams, of being drowned between battles and forced choking back to awareness only when there is something to kill? There is another layer to this possibility that suits the sharks far too well. In many readings of the Carcharodons' lore, Tyberos is as much mantle as man. A name that passes from one butcher to another, an office carried by whoever is strong enough, ruthless enough, and loyal enough to put the chapter's ledger above his own heartbeat. If that is true, then interring this Tyberos does not close the book. It splits it. Imagine a future where a new flesh and ceramite Tyberos stalks the decks of the Nicor, wearing rebuilt plate and perhaps Primaris organs, while somewhere deep in the ship's underdecks, a great hull-thickened sarcophagus sleeps, a thing the serfs call the Old Wake or the First Shade. When the chapter needs more than even their current master can provide, when a world must be turned into slurry as an example, they wake the thing in the tomb and drop it from orbit. The title Tyberos becomes plural, a man and a machine, both bearing it, each representing a different era of Carcharodon's cruelty. That is the sort of layered monstrosity that fits them almost too well. By contrast, the idea that he simply dies feels anemic. The Carcharodons already bear enough quiet curses. Their veterans go blind, called into void exile by a doom that is equal parts gene flaw and spiritual debt. Their fleets are exiled and semi-forgotten, their loyalty taken for granted, and their methods politely ignored. To take the one figure who has cohered all of that into a single terrifying silhouette and discard him off-page, to let him die not in a saga, but in a short story attached to a limited edition, would be a strange choice. It would waste a perfect avatar of their menace. They may eventually do it, of course. This universe is nothing if not fond of sudden, ugly endings. But as an immediate resolution to a tithe of shadows, it rings thin. The notion that nothing meaningful changes is thinner still. Yes, it is technically possible that the surgeons of the Carcharodons patch Tyberos up, graft on a few new augmetics, hammer out some replacement plates, and send him stalking off as if the assassination was an unpleasant but ultimately transient incident. Stories do sometimes flinch away from the implications of their own setup. Yet everything about the way this wound has been written argues against that. You do not cloak the account behind a special edition, make it so that only the truly invested will notice it, and then use that space simply to say that the Red Wake was nearly killed, but shrugged it off. You do not tie his injury to Dark Mechanicus' treachery and grey tithes, and the chapter's access to Primaris technology if your goal is to return to the status quo. The wound exists to justify transformation. That is the heart of it. Each path out of that Forge World corridor says something different about the Carcharodons and about the Imperium that exploits them. A Primaris Tyberos would be the chapter dragged, bloody and snarling, toward the designs of Robut Guilliman. The Outer Dark would not be left untouched by the New Order. Even the sharks would be collared, in a fashion, their masters' very bones rebuilt to match the current template of Imperial truth. It would be an admission that no one, not even the nomad predation fleets at the edge of myth, can avoid the Primarch's long shadow. A Dreadnought Tyberos, by contrast, would be the chapter leaning into its own warped reflection, embracing not renewal, but monstrosity, making their master into an engine that cannot walk among mortals, cannot stand comfortably on the bridge of the Nicor, cannot do anything but remember and kill. It would be a choice to define themselves not by how well they adapt to the new Imperium, but by how thoroughly they embody the old nightmare that an Imperium of crumbling shrines and corpse altars has always been. In that reading, the Carcharodons do not submit to the Primarch's pattern. They nail their identity into iron and drop it on the heads of anyone foolish enough to think the Outer Dark can be tamed. It is hard to deny that the latter option fits their aesthetic with an almost obscene neatness. This is a chapter whose war engines are already named for sea monsters, whose leviathans churn through fleets like grinding reefs, whose dreadnoughts are chained like beasts rather than coddled as relics. They are used to inflicting horror in the name of their void father. An iron shark, carrying within its chest the mind of the first among their killers, is exactly the kind of blasphemous practicality that makes sense to them. To seriously consider that path, we have to do more than sketch it in broad strokes. We have to imagine what it looks like when such a thing walks, when its shadow falls across enemy trenches and allied decks, when its voice growls through vox emitters in the dark. We have to understand not just the symbolism, but the texture of that existence for the man in the coffin and for the men who stand before it and call it Lord. That is the work of the next chapter. If the Reaper Lord wakes in iron, he will not wake in some modest chassis meant for a lesser ancient. There is no universe in which the sharks of the Outer Dark cut down their Shade Lord, slide what remains of him into a sarcophagus, and then bolt that coffin into a standard frame. If the Red Wake rises as a dreadnought, he will rise like a continental shelf tearing itself free of the sea. Picture the chassis first. A Leviathan hull is the natural starting point. Those hulking silhouettes already resemble walking bastions more than knights, their proportions thick and heavy, their armor surfacing like the plates of some abyssal beast. Now exaggerate that. Add mass, add weight. Imagine the artificers of the Carcharodons and the darker-minded magi who attend their grey tithes working together over a frame that has grown beyond any pattern that Mars will admit to owning. The carapace is a hunched slope of ceramite and adamantium, studded with sensor arrays and armor studs, its surfaces carved with oceanic reliefs. Not elegant waves and dolphins from some old Terran mural, but rough gouged depictions of storm fronts and tidal bores, broken teeth of rock, and the silhouettes of predators moving under the surface. Shark teeth trophies, taken from the chapter's own heraldry, and from the great void predators whose corpses they have trawled through radiation storms, hang in chain curtains from the armor plates. Some are real bone, lacquered and reinforced. Some are metal, cut in the same jagged pattern, so that when the engine moves they all grind and clatter together, like the jawbones of drowned gods. The sarcophagus at the heart of it bears a stylized echo of Tyberos' old helm. The boar-snouted visage has been abstracted and stretched, turned into a permanent iron mask. The vents become snarling nostrils. The eye lenses are recessed deep in brutal sockets. Cyclopean optics buried beneath overhanging ridges of armor, so that the machine always appears to be squinting against some invisible gale. Carved around that faceplate, the artificers have etched the names of worlds and wars in Low Gothic, High Gothic, Binharic, and in the private code signs scratched into bulkheads by Carcharodon sergeants when they want to mark a place as bled dry. The whole thing moves like a tidal wave of adamantium, a slab of industrial nightmare thudding across ground or deck, each step a punctuation mark in the death of whatever stands before it. The Mechanicus will pretend the pattern has a neat designation. They always do, somewhere on some data slate that know. One is meant to see. There will be a string of numbers and letters and Martian cant. It will not catch on. Among the adepts who know what was actually welded together in those grey Tithe forges, it will have a whispered name instead. Megalodon pattern. A half-joke, half-prayer, calling on extinct predators from old Terra's fossil records to describe a thing that now stalks stars instead of seas. A hybrid of Leviathan and Contemptor lines. Overbuilt armor layered atop overbuilt armor to make room for a sarcophagus that contains far more meat and scar tissue than any standard specification expected. Even among dreadnoughts, this would not be a comfortable fit. The occupant was always too big, even before Ruststalker blades and poisons tore him down. Now whatever is left of him is packed into the coffin like meat in a munitions crate, limbs reduced to stumps, torso braced with internal braces, cables threaded through what was once muscle and organ. The Tech Marines will have had to make choices other chapters never face. Cut here, leave that, risk phantom pain versus overload. The result is a sarcophagus that groans when power flows through it, not because the machine spirit is angry, but because the very structure is under strain from the thing inside. Arms mount the new reflections of hunger and slake. They cannot simply bolt the old lightning claws onto such a frame. The scale is wrong, the forces involved too savage. Instead, they build echoes that honor the intent rather than the exact form. On one arm, a siege drill surrounded by a halo of smaller secondary talons, all of them tipped with crushing teeth. When it spins up, the entire assembly snarls and whines, inner mechanisms clattering as they bite and tear. On the other, a massive chain claw, each finger a chain blade in its own right, cutting edges made of interlocking segments that move, even when the claw is at rest, the constant fret like a predator grinding its jaws. These weapons do not simply kill. They pulverize, they devour. A tank caught in the grasp of one is not holed, but shredded, peeled and minced, until it is a scatter of ruined components and liquefied crew. A fortress door is not breached, it is eaten. Infantry do not die with neat entry wounds and collapses. They are caught and mangled, turned into sprays of meat that barely even register to the machine's auspex before it tramps on. If any trace of the old claws was salvaged, it is here, buried in the core mechanisms, their unknown pattern serving as the spiritual heart of the new Moors. How do the Carcharodons use such a thing? Not as a siege gun parked behind a line of trenches, trading fire with artillery. Not as a backline idol rolled out for parades, and only occasionally fired to remind everyone that the chapter has venerable ancients. That is not their way. They send their engines where the killing is closest. The Megalodon pattern Red Wake would be deployed as a boarding spearhead, exactly where Tyberos has always been most himself. The Nikor's teleportariums would lock onto target coordinates deep within enemy flagships, command vessels, orbital bastions. The chamber would be lit by strobes and warning sigils as power levels climb. Serfs and Tech Marines would retreat to safe distances, joining the ring of shark-armored escorts waiting for the translation flicker. In the center of the pad, the Iron Shark stands still, all systems in standby, sarcophagus occupant, hovering in the dull half-dream of modern dreadnoughts. Translation hits, matter and energy twist, then resolve. The next heartbeat, the engine is standing in a corridor or a strategium, or a hold somewhere deep within the guts of a doomed ship. Sirens scream, gravity stutters. Flesh-panicked crew scramble, too slow, their thoughts still trying to understand how a thing that big exists in a space that small. Then, the red wake moves. There is nowhere to hide on a ship when something that massive decides to walk. Its length, deck plating buckles under the weight, bulkheads warp and tear as armor plates brush them aside. Void-hardened doors that should resist boarding torpedoes are clamped and ripped apart. Lance batteries and torpedo launch cradles become scrap caught under adamantium feet. The hull groans under impacts that were never in its design tolerances. The Reaper Lord that once paced those corridors in Terminator plate now simply obliterates the walls and rooms that displease him. For enemies, it is like watching extinction advance down a passageway. For the brothers of the Carcharodons who follow in his wake, it is something else entirely. How does a void exile feel, blind eyes clouded by their curse, when the thing called Tyberos now speaks to him from inside a steel coffin? His hands, those that have not already been taken by previous wounds or exiles, trace sigils on the hull when he passes. The echo of his own future, perhaps. If he lives long enough, if his curse takes him, maybe this is what awaits. Or maybe he hopes for the older mercy of simply vanishing into some forgotten assignment at the edge of the map and never returning. Line brothers who once stood shoulder to shoulder with the Reaper Lord in boarding actions now have to look up further still. The thing that was their master is too large to fit in the rituals of daily life. He cannot kneel in the same chapels. He cannot pace the same narrow corridors. He is wheeled and teleported and stored. Do they feel reverence, seeing him in this state, or a kind of cold terror at what the chapter is willing to do in the name of continuity? Do some of them feel the hungry itch of ambition? The thought that the title Tyberos might one day be theirs, while the original sits entombed and dreaming beneath their feet? The chaplains will preach reverence. They will describe the engine as a living saint, as the concreted will of the Void Father made manifest. They will speak of the honor of fighting before such a relic. In private, some brothers will look at the massive sarcophagus and feel something simpler and more dangerous. The realization that no matter how many worlds they harvest, no matter how many enemies they silence, this is all they are to the Imperium. Tools, teeth, meat in a box, if they are lucky enough to be valued. Think of the voice that fills those decks. Tyberos in life was never a bellowing commander. Accounts describe him as soft-spoken, his orders few words and final. Trapped in iron, his larynx is gone. What remains of his speech centers are fed into vox emitters, mounted in the sarcophagus and in the hull. When he speaks now, it is as a low, filtered growl, modulated through failing machine spirits and amplifiers, a dissonant echo bouncing down corridors faster than his own massive bulk can follow. The effect is worse, not better. A dreadnought that roars and rants is one thing. A vast engine that mutters in a quiet, distorted baritone, issuing precise, absolute orders while its claws are still wet and teeth still turning, is another. The contrast between that measured tone and the carnage that follows it would put every mortal on the Nikor's decks on edge. Even Astartes, gene-wrought to fear little, might feel the hair rise on the back of their necks when that vox rasp sounds behind them in some narrow gantry. For the thing inside the coffin, the horror is more intimate. Tyberos has always been a hunter in the truest sense. He has walked under alien skies, tasted the tang of atmosphere and smoke, felt the recoil of weapons through his own arms, the impact of blows against his own chest. He has known the animal satisfaction of closing distance, of judging prey by eye and by instinct, of being there when the claws descend. Interment takes that from him. Now he hunts through layers of mediation, Auspex feeds, targeting cursors, machine assistance. He cannot smell his enemies. He cannot hear with his own ears. He cannot feel the deck under his feet except as a shudder transmitted through plates and braces and nerves that were never meant to carry such translations. It is a hell tailored for a hunter. The acts themselves continue. Enemies still die in droves, worlds still burn, but the immediacy is gone. The joy, if he ever allowed himself that word, of the kill is reduced to a cascade of data. Hit, kill, move, hit, kill, move. The Carcharodons will praise this as purity, as the removal of distraction. Some part of Tyberos, buried in whatever remains of his skull within the sarcophagus, will know it for what it is. An endless series of hunts he can never fully inhabit. Beyond the Nekor and the Maelstrom, the rest of the Imperium would come to know this new Tyberos in a different way. In the post-Rift era, when Segmentum commanders and inquisitors look at maps torn by Warpscar and Demon Tide, when they see some pocket of resistance or heresy that no ordinary crusade can easily pulp, they already sometimes whisper the name of the Carcharodons, call the sharks, send for the Reaper Lord. Imagine what it looks like when that request is answered by a Leviathan sarcophagus translating into their war zones. An Inquisitor stands on the command deck of his flagship, watching a hololithic projection of some stubborn Xenos enclave or secessionist world. He has called for the Red Wake, perhaps never truly believing that the Outer Dark would answer. Then one day, the Auspex officers report an incoming translation within the fleet perimeter. No Voxhail, no honor guard of strike cruisers, just a single, massive teleport signature. The thing that appears in the hangar bay is too large for comfort. Deck guns auto-target until the machine spirits are beaten back. Tech priests prostrate themselves, muttering about blessed patterns and sacred engines. The coffin-eyed Dreadnought stands, shark teeth chains clattering, ocean-carved armor shedding dust and ice from whatever void it just crossed. Vox emitters crackle. A quiet, iron-edged voice informs the Inquisitor that his request has been heard and that the tithe for such service will be exacted in the usual way. Every time the Imperium wants something erased so thoroughly that no one will ever find enough pieces to reassemble a memory, they wake the sarcophagus and send it. The Red Wake becomes not just a man or a chapter, but a function, an option on a strategy slate, a weapon in a drawer that High Command opens only when it is prepared to pay a price in blood and conscience. Within the chapter, does this make them more human or less? To have your master nailed visibly into a steel coffin, his suffering on display, could serve as a reminder that even gods bleed, that no amount of gene-forged prowess or legend exempts you from the knife. Some brothers might deepen their grim camaraderie around that realization, knowing that they are all, in the end, meat shuffling towards one form of entombment or another. Equally, it could strip away the last pretense that there is anything left in them of humanity at all. If this is what they do to their most honored, if this is what service earns, then the fiction that they are still men who serve an empire begins to rot away. What remains are tools and teeth, as surely chained as the iron shark in its teleportarium cradle, moving when commanded, sleeping when stored, existing only to make problems go away. At this point, it is worth stepping back from the image and remembering the border between speculation and text. Dreadnought Tyberos does not exist in the canon yet. There is no line on any page that confirms a megalodon pattern hull stalking the decks of the Nikor. No scene of a boar-snouted sarcophagus crushing its way through a traitor flagship has been written by anyone whose words decide such things. But the framework is there, disturbingly ready. The wound, the culture, the aesthetic, the tools, they all point toward iron. All that is missing is a writer deciding to follow that current to its natural, monstrous end. By the time the sky splits and the cicatrix runs like a vertical wound through the galaxy, the sharks of the Outer Dark are already anachronisms. They are relic predators from an age when compliance fleets vanished into the black and never sent back anything but a tally of dead. Then the Primarch returns, drags a half of the Imperium back from the cliff, and with him comes a new breed of Astartes stamped to his design. The word Primaris becomes a drumbeat that no chapter can entirely shut out, not even those that stalk the edges of the map and pretend not to hear. Void exile and the talk that coils around it make one thing clear. The Carcharodons do not receive their Primaris through the neat channels that other chapters enjoy. There is no great muster at some resplendent fortress monastery, no glorious parade of fresh gene lines arriving with full doctrinal packages and carefully worded letters from Macragge. The sharks get theirs the same way they get everything, through grey ties and quiet exchanges in furnace-lit forges where the air tastes like rust and sin. It is not a smooth graft. Brothers die on the slab. At least one of the chapter's warriors never rises from the Rubicon Primaris procedure, his gene-wrought body finally running out of tolerance for being cut open and rewritten. That death is not treated as a tragic exception in an otherwise miraculous process. It is presented as the price of another supposed gift, another reminder that every time the Imperium offers you a solution, it hides a knife in the shape of that relief. Within that context, the idea of Tyberos taking the Primaris path is not the clean, heroic upgrade that a surface reading might suggest. He is already enormous, already a boundary case for Astartes' physiology. To imagine a Primaris Tyberos is to imagine a form that takes that excess and codifies it, an already monstrous silhouette rewritten into something that even the Magi of Mars might raise a servo arm at. The body that went into the forge hall on that grey Tithe world was a giant wrapped in ancient, tactical Dreadnought armor. The body that came out of the Ruststalker ambush was wreckage that only just remembered how to breathe. That matters. A Rubicon Primaris crossing attempted by an uninjured chapter master can be read as ambition or ideological alignment. A crossing attempted for the Reaper Lord in this state is something else entirely. It is desperate salvage. The apothecaries and tech marines stand around the slab, taking stock of what remains. Hearts still beating, but irregular. Lungs shredded. Organs and augmentics poisoned and punctured. Nerve pathways scorched by toxins. They can patch, graft, dose and pray, but there is only so far they can push a body that has already been pushed for centuries. The Primaris procedure, as grim as it is, offers a brutal solution. Tear it all open again. Cut out what is beyond saving. Force new organs into cavities that were never meant to share space with them. If he survives, he will not simply be a bigger version of what he was. He will be a different thing, built to a different template, his cells dancing to a new pattern, hidden in the additional organs and in the altered gene seed. The armor he would wear afterwards would have to be as much compromise as statement. Standard Mark 10 plate, as seen on parade in more conventional chapters, will not do. Nor will a simple replacement suit of Terminator armor. The artificers would need to design something that splits the difference between heavy tactical plate, exoskeletal reinforcement, and whatever new requirements a Primaris altered frame imposes. The result might be a warplate that looks like a prototype between eras, a shell that sits somewhere on the spectrum between his old ceramite reliquary and the full iron coffin of a dreadnought. An exoshell overbuilt to carry an overbuilt body festooned with shark teeth trophies and scarred with the memory of Ruststalker claws. In this light, the maiming that set all of this off feels almost too neat. A proud, stubborn, almost mythic chapter master is never going to volunteer lightly to be remade to a foreign pattern, even if that pattern comes from the gene work of a Primarch. Bleed him down to the edge of death, however, tear his warplate open and leave him staring at the ceiling of some Forge World infirmary with the taste of chem smoke and his own blood in his mouth. And the argument changes. The Rubicon stops being a matter of philosophical alignment and starts to look like the only way to keep him walking. Compared to Dreadnought interment, the Primaris route preserves more of what Tyberos has always been. A dreadnought is a prisoner wired into a walking coffin. His senses are mediated through machine spirits, his body reduced to memories and occasional pain signals. A Primaris converted Tyberos would still feel air on his scarred skin, still be able to walk a deck in his own boots, still stand at a viewing bay and watch the void slide past without needing a bank of Auspex relays to tell him where the stars are. Both procedures are butchery dressed in litany, but one leaves the subject able to taste, see, and move under his own power. The other buries him alive in iron. From the point of view of those who sit at the higher tables of the Imperium, the choice between these two forms is no choice at all. Guilliman's agents want Primaris leaders, not crypt-born engines that have to be wheeled out like relic artillery. A Primaris Tyberos can attend councils, speak on behalf of his chapter in war rooms and at treaty tables, however frosty those meetings might be. He can be seen leading from the front in the kind of heroic silhouette that looks good on recruiting pics. He can be, in short, presented as proof that even the sharks of the outer dark have fallen in step with the new design. A Dreadnought Tyberos, by contrast, is a weapon and little else. No one invites a sarcophagus to a diplomatic summit. You do not hold joint planning sessions with an iron giant that talks in vox growls and answers most questions by asking for target coordinates. You wheel such a thing out when you want a district or a species erased, and you are willing to pay the price. From the point of view of a Lord Commander or an Ordo Lord, the value of a Primaris Chapter Master is far more flexible. The cost, for the Predator himself, is harder to tally. Primaris bodies are taller, stronger, more efficient. Extra organs tweak metabolism, perception, regeneration. A Primaris Tyberos would hit harder, recover faster, and stand as a more intimidating presence even among his own kind. In a universe that measures everything in lethality, those are virtues. Yet there is a risk of dilution. Part of what has made the Shade Lord so unsettling for so long is that he has always felt slightly wrong, even by Astartes standards. Too big, too quiet, too far from the neat doctrinal boxes that codex-minded minds like to force war into. Recasting him in the common Primaris mold might sand away some of that strangeness. He would still be terrifying, but in a familiar way, closer to the statues that adorn imperial shrines and recruitment halls. Less nightmare from the outer dark, more standard issue demigod of war, even if that standard has been raised. The Carcharodons themselves are already experimenting with what that tension looks like. Their third company, by the time of Void Exile, is largely formed of Primaris brothers. Their armor marks are mismatched, half old, half new, plates from different foundries bolted together into functional shells. The company fights with the same brutal doctrines as the rest of the chapter. There is no sense that the arrival of Primaris has made the sharks any kinder. If anything, it has only sharpened some of their edges. They have proven that they can bolt new flesh onto old ways without an identity crisis. In such a context, Tyberos walking that same path could be spun as unity. The master of the Nikor takes the same risk his brothers have taken, submits to the same carving. The old flesh reaches toward the new, not in reverence for Guilliman, but in the same pragmatic spirit with which the chapter has always adopted tools that work. It would be a brutal sort of solidarity, the kind that leaves blood on the floor of the apothecarian, but solidarity all the same. There is a dark kind of irony in the idea that, in a galaxy where many venerable chapter masters cling to their firstborn flesh and their ancient armor out of sheer stubbornness, it would be the exile predators of the outer dark who embrace Primaris transformation with the least sentiment. The sharks have never been romantic about their own biology. They see meat as something to be harvested, processed, and used. If rewriting their own lord into a more effective killer serves the ledger, they will do it without flinching. Even that may not be the final form. The reality of this setting tends to favor uneasy compromise over clean resolutions. One can picture a future where Tyberos has crossed the Rubicon and risen in a Primaris body, only to find that even that enhanced frame struggles to contain what he has become. The armor built for him after his maiming and conversion might look, from a distance, uncomfortably close to that megalodon pattern coffin we imagined. Oversized warplate, exoskeletal reinforcement, layers of ceramic and plasteel that make him move like a man half a step away from being a dreadnought already. In that halfway state, he would be both symbol and foreshadowing. Not yet entombed, but visibly heading toward it, every scraped plate and strained actuator a reminder that the line between walking demigod and walking tomb is thinner than anyone would care to admit. The chapter would have its Primaris lord, the Imperium its proof of compliance, and the outer, dark its predator. For a while, the title question hangs over all this like a blade. Is Tyberos becoming a dreadnought? The honest answer, for now, is that he is not there yet. The text has not nailed him into a sarcophagus. No canonical scene shows his iron bulk crushing decks underfoot. But every choice made around him in recent lore tightens the noose. The maiming in a tithe of shadows, the grey ties that bring Primaris tech into his orbit, the presence of half-grafted Primaris companies in his fleet, the chapter's ruthless utilitarianism toward flesh and metal alike. All of it narrows the range of believable futures. Whether the next step is a Primaris rebirth, a plunge into iron, or some grotesque path that brushes both, the era of Tyberos as an untouched myth stalking the void in the same old warplate is over. The shark has been hooked. Now we wait to see whether the line ends at a new suit of armor or snaps tight around a coffin. The first thing to say, before the speculation and the fantasies of iron and gene-forged rebirth, is simple and unvarnished. As the lore stands, the Shade Lord lives. In the account called A Tithe of Shadows, Tyberos the Red Wake does not die on that Forge World floor. The Ruststalker blades tear him open, the poisons bite deep, the tactical dreadnought armor that has carried him through Badab and the nameless wars of the Outer Dark is reduced to wreckage. But his hearts keep beating. He survives the ambush. The text is explicit about that much, and just as explicit about what it refuses to do. It does not kill him. It does not declare him Primaris. It does not weld him, in so many words, into a sarcophagus and bolt that coffin into a Leviathan frame. Those are doors it leaves closed, for now. What we know, concretely, is the wreckage. His warplate is destroyed beyond battlefield salvage. His body is grievously injured, badly enough to shock even the Carcharodons, who see him sprawled under the dead. Ruststalkers. The attempt on his life comes through corrupted Mechanicus assets on a grey tithe world, in a place that should have been as close to secure ground as a nomad predation fleet ever gets. And when the story is done showing us that, when it has painted the Reaper Lord lying broken in the smoke and lumen glare, it turns its gaze away. There is no lingering shot of apothecaries at work, no list of grafted augmetics, no easy reassurance that he will be back on his feet in the next scene. The narrative walks us right up to the doors of the surgery bays and then leaves us standing in the corridor. That refusal is not clumsiness. It is not an oversight. It is deliberate. By wrecking his armor and his flesh and then declining to tell us what they do with the pieces, the writers have dropped Tyberos onto a crossroads. From this position, future stories can credibly justify almost any extreme. If they want him Primaris, they have an apothecarian slab already soaked in his blood, and a chapter with access to Rubicon technology through grey tithes and clandestine Mechanicus deals. If they want him interred, they have described wounds severe enough to make a sarcophagus feel like the only thing keeping him from the throne's cold judgment. If they want something stranger, a uniquely Carcharodon solution, they have seeded the necessary elements for experimental warplate, or some sarcophagus equivalent that fits the chapter's warped rites. Each of the major paths we have traced has its own internal logic and its own thematic weight. It is worth laying those out cleanly before we pretend to answer the question the title has been circling. Dreadnought Tyberos, the Iron Shark, fits the chapter's image with obscene precision. The Carcharodons already favor Leviathan engines, war machines named for sea monsters, ancient contemptors, and heavier dread frames that lumber through their enemies like predators through shoals. They already treat their dreadnoughts more like weapons than relics, chained thunderheads to drop on cultures that must be pulped instead of tithed. Entombing their master in a custom hull carved with oceanic reliefs and shark teeth trophies would cement him as a permanent, torturous presence haunting their future wars. He would become living continuity in the worst possible way. A sarcophagus full of memories and hate, rattling to life whenever someone cuts a deal in a grey Tithe hall and writes Red Wake in the margin. It would also echo their habit of fighting with grotesque, over-engineered relics. A megalodon pattern hull built around a too-big corpse is exactly the sort of ugly practicality they indulge in without shame. Primaris Tyberos, by contrast, fits the broader age. The Indomitus era expects to see Primaris leadership. Gilliman's doctrinal tide has washed across chapters far more conservative and well-placed than a semi-exiled fleet of outer dark butchers. The Sharks already have Primaris brothers in their companies, acquired not via neat crusade allocations, but through those same grey tithes and shadow dealings that brought them so close to dark Mechanicus treachery. One of their own dies on the slab crossing the Rubicon, underlining that the process is not some clean upgrade, but another form of sanctioned butchery. Within that context, dragging a mortally wounded Tyberos through the same agony turns the Rubicon from a question of pride into a desperate salvage operation. If he survives, the Imperium gets exactly what its current masters want to see: a Primaris chapter. Master who can stand in war rooms, parley under banners, accept commendations and condemnations with equal, shark-eyed calm, and then go back to tearing the outer dark apart in the name of a Primarch he has never seen. And the fiction gets to keep him mobile, a presence who can still walk a deck and loom in a doorway, rather than a mostly battlefield-bound sarcophagus that writers must wrestle into every scene. There is a third way, more in keeping with the chapter's habit of leaving scars where other forces would seal wounds. In that reading, Tyberos is a mantle as much as a man. The battered original on the slab becomes relic, in one form or another. Perhaps he dies under the knives and is entombed in a hidden vault in the Nikor's depths, a secret shade that only chaplains and tech marines visit. Perhaps his living remnant is wired into a dreadnought shell that almost never wakes, a chained storm reserved for only the worst hunts. Meanwhile, a new flesh and ceramite shade lord is raised, gene-wrought and exile-marked, given the claws that may or may not be rebuilt from Hunger and Slake's wreckage, and told to wear the name. Old tooth, new bite. Leave the previous teeth embedded in the chapter's gums, buried but not forgotten, and grow more on top. It would be a shark-like solution in the purest sense, honoring continuity by layering it rather than preserving it as a single unbroken entity. Behind all of these possibilities sits the same grim truth that underpins everything in this setting. There are no clean upgrades in the 41st millennium. There is no such thing as a painless improvement. Crossing the Rubicon is not an ascension, it is a sanctioned mutilation. Interment in a dreadnought is not a noble retirement. It is a life sentence in a box filled with fluid and screaming wires. Even simple survival, patched together with augmetics and cauterized flesh, is usually just a slower route to the same destinations. For Tyberos, every path out of that forge hall is a variety of torture. Surgery that rewrites his genes, surgery that nails him into iron, or the long, lonely decay of exile for a body that will never be what it was. In a universe, even the gods treat their servants with that kind of casual cruelty. It would be almost offensive if the Red Wake were allowed a neat, tidy recovery. So what is the answer? Put in the blunt, declarative style that suits both the subject and the tone of the age? Based on what we have, on the shape of the new lore and the slow accretion of detail around the Carcharodons over the years, Dreadnought Tyberos feels brutally plausible. The aesthetic fit is too on the nose to ignore. The cultural fit is tight. The idea has already taken root in the imaginations of those corners of the community that pay attention to such things, spinning out images of Leviathan hulls and Megalodon patterns in the dark between official releases. Everything about the chapter's relationship to its engines and its relics says that if anyone would think nothing of nailing their master into a walking tomb, it is them. And yet, Primaris Tyberos still feels like the slightly more likely next step, in purely narrative terms. It dovetails with the era's obsessions. It keeps him usable as a character across a wide range of stories and mediums. It plays directly into the threads Void Exile has already woven about Primaris. Integration and Rubicon risks in a nomad predation context. As a piece on the board, a Primaris Shadelord keeps more options open for longer. A Dreadnought Red Wake, once committed, is a heavier, more limited presence. The most likely shape of things, then, is a two-stage drowning. Tyberos crosses the Rubicon because he has been broken badly enough that no one can argue against it. He walks again in new flesh and over-engineered plate, perhaps closer in silhouette to his memes than he has ever actually been. And somewhere down the line, when that new flesh has been chewed on by enough wars and enough toxins, when his usefulness as a mobile icon is outweighed by his value as a chained storm, the sarcophagus opens its mouth again. The tide of iron that we have imagined does not crash over him immediately. It waits, as the sea always waits, gnawing at whatever cliffs are put in its way. In the end, though, the exact chassis they nail him into matters less than the fact that the Red Wake bleeds at all. For years, he has been one of those fixed shapes in the nightmare, a constant stalking presence in the dark beyond the maelstrom. By tearing open his armor and wiring betrayal into the very mechanisms that were supposed to feed his chapter, the lore has sent a clear signal. These are not safe myths. The monsters can be hurt. When a figure like Tyberos takes a wound, it is never just about one warrior. It ripples out through the culture that worships him, through the enemies who fear him, through the strange economy of grey tithes and quiet exterminations that has kept the Imperium from collapsing a little faster than it already is. Somewhere out beyond the light of the Astronomicon, a forge hall still smells of rust, cordite, and burned augmetics. The stains left there mark the point where a particular future split. Whether the man whose blood made those marks ends up in enhanced flesh, in iron, or in some abominable state between the two, his fate is just another reminder of the real calculus at work in the dark. In the void beyond the maelstrom, even the predators are one unlucky heartbeat away from becoming screaming ghosts entombed in steel, dragged up from drowning sleep only when there is fresh meat to feed the machines.